Hello everyone. Today we're going to begin with a single image. A cake. A simple cake, decorated with careful hands, carried through the glow of a restaurant that smelled of roasted meat and polished wood. I remember how heavy it felt, not because of its weight, but because of the silence that followed me as I walked toward their table. My son was there, my grandchildren, and my daughter-in-law. Her smile perfect, her voice lowered just enough for only me to hear. "Don't embarrass us here." Her whisper was sharp, almost invisible to everyone else, but it sliced through me like glass. The room was warm, but I felt a chill rising inside me, spreading down to my fingertips. The cake wobbled in my hands, and for a brief second, I thought I might drop it right there on the floor. It wasn't the words alone. It was the history behind them. Because that cake was not just a dessert. It was an offering. It was a symbol of love, of effort, of wanting to belong at their table. Not as a guest, but as family. I had baked dozens of cakes in my life. Birthdays, anniversaries, quiet Sunday dinners. Each one carried sugar, flour, butter, but also something more. Devotion. And in that moment, my devotion was dismissed as shame. The restaurant carried on around me, the clinking of glasses, the low hum of conversations, the laughter of strangers. To everyone else, nothing unusual had happened. But to me, the world had shifted. My son avoided my eyes. My grandchildren stared down at their plates, and I stood there, holding a cake no one wanted, hearing words no one else had heard. I want you to picture it. Not as my story, but as a moment that could happen to anyone who has ever given too much, who has ever hoped too deeply, who has ever longed for a place at the table only to be told, quietly, that they don't belong. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really like what I'm doing here. And tell me, in the comments below, where you are watching from and when. Because stories like these, they travel further than we imagine. When I walked into that restaurant, I wasn't just carrying a cake. I was carrying years of effort, years of silent giving, years of trying to be the steady foundation no one noticed, but everyone depended on. And the whisper I received in return was not just rejection. It was revelation. It told me what I had refused to admit for years, that maybe I wasn't family in their eyes. Maybe I was convenience. Maybe I was the person who filled the gaps when they wanted time for themselves, who stepped in when money was short, who stayed quiet when respect was missing. Standing there, my hands trembling against the smooth surface of the cake box, I realized something important. The moment of humiliation doesn't come when everyone laughs at you or when the world points and mocks. It comes when the people you love most remind you that your love is not welcome. And so this story begins here, with a cake no one wanted, a whisper no one else heard, and a heart that finally understood it had been breaking all along. From the outside, their family looked perfect. The kind of perfect that photographs well. Matching outfits for holiday cards, carefully posed smiles, and a house that always smelled faintly of fresh paint and lavender candles. Friends who visited would often remark, "What a beautiful family your son has built." And I would nod, smile, and keep my silence. Because on the surface, yes, it was beautiful. But beauty, I had learned, could be skin-deep, fragile, even cruel. They were the picture of modern success. My son, Miles, worked in finance, tall, confident, moving through the world with the polished voice of someone who had learned to fit in everywhere. His wife, Joy, was equally polished, always impeccably dressed, always saying the right words at parties. Together, they looked unstoppable. And for years, I told myself this was what I had wanted for him. Stability, prosperity, a family of his own. But a family that looks perfect on the outside can feel very different when you're standing just outside the frame. I was invited to birthdays, yes. To holidays, sometimes. But it was always clear I wasn't part of the inner circle. Decisions were made without me. Traditions I had cherished with my son disappeared quietly, replaced with new ones Joy curated, polished, branded as her own. I would walk into their home with dishes I'd cooked, only to see them pushed aside for store-bought alternatives that matched the theme better. And when people asked about me, Joy would smile and say, "Oh, that's Miles's mother. She helps out with the kids sometimes." As if my identity had been reduced to a service, a role, not a person, not family. But perhaps what cut deeper was my son's silence. Miles, who once sat at my kitchen table, telling me about his school projects, his dreams of traveling, his worries about making me proud, now seemed distant. He rarely called without a purpose. If he needed help with the kids, or if money was tight, I would hear from him. But rarely, if ever, did he call simply to ask how I was doing. It was as though the closeness we once had was inconvenient now, something best hidden away, like old photographs in a drawer. At first, I tried not to notice. Families change, I told myself. Children grow, marriages shift priorities, and mothers must learn to step aside. I said it so often that I almost believed it, but small moments told the truth. The way Joy's smile faltered when I entered a room, the way conversations went quiet when I joined them, the way my seat at the table was always the one at the edge. They didn't need to say it out loud. I could feel it. But families are complicated things. We learn to excuse the hurts, to overlook the slights, because love is supposed to cover everything. And I did love them. Fiercely. I loved my son, I loved my grandchildren, and even with Joy, I tried to extend the kind of love I thought would win her over. I brought gifts, I cooked meals, I showed up whenever they called. I told myself that if I gave enough, I would eventually be folded into their perfect picture, that I would belong. The truth, of course, was different. Looking back now, I can see the pattern. Families that seem perfect often require someone else to carry the weight of that perfection. The spotless house, the beautiful photographs, the effortless appearances, they weren't effortless at all. They were maintained by keeping uncomfortable truths out of sight. And I was one of those truths. It's strange, isn't it? To love a family so much, and yet feel like a stranger in their midst. To watch your own son laugh at jokes you're not invited to share. To see your grandchildren grow up with traditions you're excluded from. To smile at photographs where you don't appear, and tell yourself it's fine. But it wasn't fine. It never had been. Because while they looked perfect to the world, the cracks were there, sharp, silent, cutting deeper with every polite smile and every whisper I pretended not to hear. And one day, those cracks would split wide open, and I would no longer be able to hide from the truth. That perfection was never real, and the cost of maintaining it was me. The first warning signs didn't arrive as thunderclaps. They came quietly, almost politely, like small shadows passing over a sunny day. Easy to ignore, easy to excuse, until the shadows lengthened, and suddenly you realized the light was gone. I remember one of the earliest moments. It was Emma's 3rd birthday party. I had spent the morning baking cupcakes, carefully decorating them with pink frosting and tiny sugar flowers. I wrapped them gently, tucked them into a basket, and arrived at their house, beaming. Emma loved cupcakes. She had helped me stir the batter so many times in my kitchen, her small hands dusted with flour, her giggles echoing through the room. I thought this would be a gift that made her day brighter. But when I walked through the door, Joy's smile stiffened. "Oh," she said, her eyes glancing down at the basket as though it were a problem to be solved. "We already ordered a cake from the bakery," It matches the decorations." She said it lightly, almost apologetically. But she took the basket from my hands and set it in the kitchen, far from the main table. The cupcakes never made it out of their wrapping. By the time the party ended, they were still sitting untouched, quietly forgotten. I told myself it didn't matter. Kids love cake. Emma was happy. That was enough. But something inside me had dimmed. There were other moments too. The first Christmas after Tommy was born, I bought him a tiny knitted sweater with red and green stripes. I'd spent weeks making it, my fingers aching, the yarn carefully chosen. But when I handed the gift to Joy, she gave a polite smile, folded it back into the box and said, "Thank you, but he already has plenty of clothes." Later, when I saw the family photos they sent out to friends, Tommy was wearing a store-bought outfit, perfectly color-coordinated with everyone else. My sweater was nowhere in sight. It wasn't just the gifts. It was the conversations. I would try to join in, to share stories, to laugh at the table, but Joy's eyes would flicker toward me, cool and quick, as if to remind me I was interrupting. Miles rarely intervened. If anything, he seemed to shrink when Joy was displeased, like a boy caught between loyalty and fear. And then there were the times I wasn't invited. Subtle at first, a barbecue I only heard about after it happened, a school recital I learned of too late. "It was last minute," Miles would say. "We didn't think you'd mind." I did mind, but I said nothing, because admitting the hurt would mean admitting the truth. I was being pushed out. The thing about warning signs is that they're easy to dismiss when you're desperate to hold on. I told myself I was overreacting, that Joy was just particular, that she wanted control, that it wasn't personal. I told myself my son loved me, that the children loved me, that these small exclusions didn't mean what they seemed to mean. But the whispers began to grow louder. One night, after I'd watched the children while Joy and Miles went to dinner, I heard Emma repeat something in her tiny voice. "Mommy says Grandma is too much." She said it innocently, without malice, just repeating what she had heard. But the words sank like stones in my chest. Too much. That was the label I had been given, quietly, without discussion. Too much of a presence, too much of an intrusion, too much of a reminder that their perfect picture wasn't entirely theirs alone. I drove home in silence that night, gripping the wheel tightly, blinking back tears that refused to stop. And still, I tried to excuse it. Maybe Joy was tired. Maybe she was stressed. Maybe Emma misunderstood. Maybe. But deep down, I knew. The warning signs had been there all along. The unopened cupcakes, the unused sweater, the missed invitations, the whispers repeated by children who should never have carried them. They were all pointing to the same truth. I was no longer welcome in the life I had helped build. And the worst part? I wasn't ready to admit it. Not yet. So I kept showing up, kept baking, kept giving, kept hoping. I told myself that love was enough, that patience would win them over, that one day they would see me not as too much, but as exactly what a mother and grandmother should be. I didn't realize then how much it would cost me to keep ignoring the signs. I didn't realize how much more painful it would be when the whispers turned into open words, when the exclusion became humiliation, when the cake I carried into a restaurant would become the symbol of every rejection I had endured. The first warning signs may have been small, but they were enough to tell me where the road was leading. I just wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. There are nights when memories come uninvited, when the silence of an empty room fills with echoes of laughter that once belonged to another time. For me, those memories often circle back to my son, the boy I raised, the boy who once trusted me with his entire world. Miles wasn't born into perfection. We didn't have the polished photographs or the curated family gatherings back then. What we had was small, sometimes messy, sometimes uncertain. But we had each other. He was my only child, and from the moment I held him in my arms, I promised myself that no matter how hard life became, I would give him everything I had. I remember the way he used to run into my arms after school, backpack bouncing, voice spilling with excitement as he told me about a spelling test he had aced, or a new game he had played at recess. His joy was pure, unfiltered, like sunlight, and I was his anchor, the person he came to with both his triumphs and his fears. There were nights he couldn't sleep, when thunderstorms rattled the windows and fear crept into his room. I would sit beside him, stroking his hair, whispering that storms always pass, that no night lasts forever. And in the dim light of his bedroom lamp, I would feel his small hand grip mine, trusting me completely. When he was 10, he wanted to build a treehouse in the old oak in our backyard. We had no money for lumber, so I found discarded wood at construction sites, hauling it home in the trunk of our car. Together, we hammered and nailed, piece by piece, until it stood, crooked, imperfect, but ours. He declared it his castle, and I remember thinking that if all I could give him was a crooked castle built with love, it would be enough. Through his teenage years, when distance sometimes grew between us, I held on to those small moments. The late-night talks in the kitchen over reheated pizza, the afternoons at the park when he practiced basketball, and I clapped for every shot he made, even the ones that missed. He wasn't just my son. He was my companion, my reason, the center of the life I had built after so many struggles. I still remember his college acceptance letter, the way his hands shook when he opened it, the way his eyes widened in disbelief, the way he whispered, "Mom, we did it. Because in his heart, he knew we had walked that road together. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment I had chosen his needs over my own. Even when he met Joy, at first, I thought it was another chapter in our shared story. I saw the light in his eyes, the way he stood taller, the way he wanted to impress her. He told me about their first dates, his nervousness, his hopes. He asked me if I thought she was the one, and I told him what every mother would tell her son when she sees him happy. If she makes you feel safe and seen, then she is. But somewhere along the way, that boy disappeared. The boy who once confided in me, who once reached for my hand when storms rattled his windows, now looked past me. Our conversations became shorter, scripted, as though rehearsed. He stopped asking for my opinion, stopped sharing his dreams. When he did call, it was rarely to talk. It was to ask. "Mom, could you watch the kids this weekend? Mom, could you help with the down payment? Mom, could you?" Each request felt like a transaction, and though I always said yes, a part of me grieved, because I wasn't just losing my son to adulthood. I was losing the closeness that had once been unshakable. I sometimes wonder when it shifted. Was it gradual? A slow erosion that I didn't notice until the ground gave way beneath me? Or was there a single moment, hidden in the blur of years, when he stopped seeing me as the person who built castles out of scrap wood and became instead the person who could be counted on to fill in the gaps? The memories still come, though. They arrive when I least expect them. The sound of children's laughter outside reminds me of his small footsteps racing through our house. The smell of rain on the pavement brings back the storms I soothed him through. Even the sight of an old oak tree makes me remember that crooked castle we built together. And when those memories come, I can't help but ask myself, where did that boy go? The boy who said, "We did it"? The boy who trusted me with everything? Did he vanish, swallowed by the weight of responsibility? by the expectations of a polished life? Or did he simply forget who I was in the glow of someone else's light? It is a cruel thing to raise a child with all the love you have, only to watch him become a stranger in your presence. Cruel, and yet common. I know I am not the only mother who has felt this distance grow, who has wondered if her child remembers the sacrifices made, the nights spent worrying, the years given without hesitation. Devotion has a strange way of disguising itself. At first, it feels like love, warm, steady, unwavering. But over time, devotion can shift into something quieter, heavier, almost invisible. It becomes duty. It becomes habit. It becomes a pattern where giving is expected, not cherished, and where silence becomes the only language left to speak. That was the kind of devotion I lived with as a grandmother. When Emma was born, I thought I had found my second chance at joy. Holding her in my arms for the first time, I felt the same rush of awe and fierce love I had felt the day Miles was born. She was so tiny, so perfect, her fingers curling tightly around mine. I whispered promises into the air, that I would always be there for her, that she would never feel unloved, that my presence would be her safe place. And when Tommy came 2 years later, I doubled those promises. 2 grandchildren, 2 lights in my life, they became my purpose. I didn't mind the late nights. I didn't mind the endless babysitting, the times I was called without notice. Joy would call at the last minute. "Could you come over? We need a night out." And I would be there before she hung up the phone. If Miles asked for money for preschool tuition, I wrote the check before he finished the sentence. If the kids needed new clothes, I bought them. If they needed lessons, swimming, gymnastics, art, I found the money somewhere. Each time I told myself, this is love. This is what family does. But there's a fine line between love and servitude. And somewhere along the way, I crossed it. I became the dependable shadow, the one who filled the gaps so seamlessly that no one even noticed they were gaps anymore. If Joy wanted a weekend away, she assumed I would take the children. If Miles wanted to buy something just out of reach financially, he assumed I would make up the difference. It was no longer requests, it was routine, and I never said no, because how could I? When Emma ran to me with her arms open, squealing, "Grandma," at the top of her lungs, all the doubts vanished. When Tommy climbed into my lap and fell asleep with his head on my shoulder, I forgot every whisper, every dismissal. In those moments, I wasn't an outsider. I was the safe place I had promised to be. That was the trap of devotion. The love of those children blinded me to everything else. It allowed me to excuse Joy's coldness, Miles's silence, the way I was treated as staff rather than family. It convinced me that as long as the children loved me, I could endure anything. But love built on silence is fragile. I remember one Saturday evening, after watching the children all day, Joy came home from her spa trip, still glowing from luxury. She dropped her bag by the door, glanced at the toys scattered on the floor, and sighed. "I'll never understand how you let them make such a mess. It takes me hours to clean after you've been here." She didn't see the games I'd played with them, the laughter, the memories made in every spilled crayon and toppled block. She saw only inconvenience, and my silence, once again, answered for me. I drove home late that night, the children's hugs still lingering on my arms, Joy's words still ringing in my ears, and I told myself, as I always did, that it was worth it. That the devotion I gave was for the children, not for her, not even for Miles anymore. But devotion without recognition begins to carve into the soul. It leaves marks, invisible at first, then undeniable. You begin to notice the absence of gratitude. You begin to notice that your name is only spoken when something is needed. You begin to notice that when you are present, you are tolerated, not celebrated. And still, you stay. Because leaving would feel like betrayal. Not of them, but of the children who love you, who see none of the tension swirling beneath the surface. You stay because you fear what will happen to them if your devotion disappears. You stay because the silence feels safer than the risk of breaking it. That was the life I had built for myself as a grandmother. A life where my devotion was unending and my voice was absent. The irony is, when people looked at me from the outside, they said, "You're so lucky. You're so involved in your grandchildren's lives." They saw the photographs of birthdays, the family dinners, the moments where I smiled with the children on my lap. They didn't see the price I was paying behind that smile. They didn't see how devotion, unbalanced and unreturned, had begun to consume me. Sometimes at night, I would sit at my kitchen table, the house too quiet, and wonder when I had stopped being a mother and grandmother and started being a servant. I would think of the promises I whispered to Emma and Tommy when they were newborns, and wonder if those promises had become chains binding me to a role where love and labor were indistinguishable. Humiliation has a peculiar sound. It doesn't roar, it doesn't thunder. It hums, soft, steady, like the low murmur of a restaurant where everyone else is laughing, eating, enjoying themselves, while you sit frozen with words that have just stripped the ground from beneath your feet. That night, I had walked in carrying the cake as if it were more than dessert. For me, it was a bridge. It was proof that I was still trying, still wanting to be part of them, still willing to put my love on a plate for everyone to share. The frosting was smooth, the candles carefully chosen, the message written in neat letters. I had stayed up late making it, whispering to myself, "This will make them smile. This will remind them that I belong here too." But instead of smiles, I was met with a whisper. "Don't embarrass us here." Those words didn't just bruise me, they unmade me. They reduced years of sacrifice, years of devotion, years of giving into a single sharp dismissal. And the worst part? No one came to my defense. My son sat at the table, his hands folded, his eyes downcast. He didn't look at me. He didn't speak. He didn't stop her. That silence, his silence, was louder than Joy's whisper. Because a whisper can be cruel, but silence can be a betrayal. The grandchildren shifted in their seats, confused. Emma looked at me with wide eyes, as though sensing something was wrong, but not fully understanding. Tommy fidgeted, swinging his legs under the table, oblivious to the storm that had just broken. Around us, the restaurant carried on. Glasses clinked, forks scraped plates, bursts of laughter echoed from nearby tables. To them, it was just another evening. To me, it was the moment my role in that family was publicly defined. Not as a mother, not as a grandmother, but as a problem, an inconvenience, an embarrassment. I forced a smile, though my lips trembled. I placed the cake gently on the table, even though every part of me wanted to retreat, to disappear, to escape the sting of their rejection. But pride held me there. Pride, and the desperate hope that if I stayed silent, I could salvage something. "Here," I said softly, my voice breaking despite my efforts. "I thought it would be nice to celebrate." No one clapped. No one thanked me. Joy gave a thin smile and turned the conversation back to herself, to her day, to her plans. My son nodded along, pretending nothing had happened, and the cake sat there, untouched, as though it too had been silenced. That was the humiliation. Not the whisper itself, but the way the room swallowed it whole and carried on, as though I were invisible. It's strange how public humiliation doesn't always look dramatic. There was no shouting, no scene, just a whisper, a silence, and a cake that no one wanted. But sometimes the quietest humiliations cut the deepest, because they strip you of dignity without giving you even the release of a confrontation. I tried to eat that night. I tried to join their conversations, to laugh when laughter was expected. But every word felt heavy in my mouth. Every bite turned to dust. My hands shook as I held my fork, and I kept my eyes on my plate so no one would see the tears threatening to fall. What hurt the most wasn't Joy's disdain, it was Miles's absence. The boy who once clung to me during storms, who once whispered, "We did it," when his dreams came true, was nowhere to be found. The man sitting across from me wasn't my son. He was someone else, someone I couldn't reach, someone who had chosen silence over me. By the end of the meal, the cake remained unopened. The waiter asked politely if we wanted it cut, and Joy answered quickly, "No, we'll take it home." Her tone was firm, final. The box was closed, carried away, and my offering disappeared without ever being shared. That was the moment I knew something inside me had broken. It wasn't just about the cake. It was about everything it represented. Every gift ignored, every effort dismissed, every time I had been told in whispers or silences that my presence was too much. The cake was simply the proof, the physical embodiment of all the ways I had been humiliated quietly, without witnesses, until now. Driving home later that night, the city lights blurred through my tears. My hands clenched the steering wheel, and I asked myself a question I had been too afraid to face. What am I doing? Why am I still here, begging for a place in their lives when all I am to them is an embarrassment? Humiliation, I realized, isn't just about what others do to you. It's about what you allow yourself to endure. And I had endured too much. That night marked a turning point, though I didn't know it then, because humiliation has a way of planting seeds. Seeds of anger, seeds of grief, seeds of awakening, and though it would take time, those seeds would eventually grow into something stronger. A decision, a boundary, a refusal to keep living as an afterthought. Silence has a texture. It isn't empty. It presses against you, heavy, suffocating, a reminder of all the words that should have been spoken, but weren't. After that night at the restaurant, silence became my constant companion. When Joy whispered those words, "Don't embarrass us here," the room froze in my mind. I had half expected someone, anyone, to break it, to laugh it off, to correct her, to say, "Don't talk to her like that." But nothing came. Miles didn't speak. My grandchildren looked down at their plates. The rest of the evening moved forward as though nothing had happened, as though the humiliation had been invisible. But it wasn't invisible to me. The silence lingered long after the meal ended. It followed me into the car as I drove home, headlights cutting through the dark streets. It echoed in my kitchen when I placed my keys on the counter and stood staring at the stillness of my own house. It kept me awake that night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail until I could hear her whisper again and again, louder with each memory. The morning after, I tried to reach for an explanation. I told myself maybe Joy hadn't meant it the way it sounded. Maybe she was stressed. Maybe she was embarrassed about something else, and her words slipped out wrong. I tried to give her excuses the way I had so many times before. But what gnawed at me wasn't her words. It was Miles's silence. Because in every family, there are moments when you rely on the people you love to protect you, to stand beside you, to say, "Enough." I had protected him his whole life, through scraped knees, heartbreaks, failures, storms that rattled our little house. And in that moment, when I needed even the smallest defense, he gave me nothing. His silence told me everything. The aftermath of silence is not immediate rage. It's something slower, more corrosive. It eats at you in moments when no one else is watching. It makes you second-guess yourself, your worth, your role. I found myself staring at the mirror in the bathroom, asking questions I never thought I'd ask. Am I truly an embarrassment? Have I become a burden? Am I nothing more than the grandmother who cooks, cleans, pays, and then leaves quietly? Days passed, and no one mentioned the incident. Not Joy, not Miles. The children, bless them, carried on as though nothing had changed. They still hugged me, still asked me to read them bedtime stories when I came over. But I couldn't shake the sense that something inside me had shifted permanently. When Miles finally called a week later, his voice was casual, almost cheerful. "Hey Mom, can you watch the kids this Saturday? We're going out with friends." I froze, the phone pressed to my ear. The silence stretched between us. Part of me wanted to scream, "Do you not remember? Do you not care? Do you think I can just swallow those words and move on?" But instead, I heard myself saying, "Of course. What time?" That's the cruelest part about silence. You begin to mimic it. You learn to swallow your own voice, to hide the ache, to carry the weight alone. The Saturday came. I arrived on time, as always, with snacks and games tucked into my bag. Joy barely greeted me before rushing out the door in heels. Miles kissed the children goodbye, then followed after her. And once again, I was left behind, not as family, but as staff. That night, after the children fell asleep, I sat alone in their living room. The silence there was different from the silence of my own home. It was sharper, colder, a silence that said I was tolerated, but not wanted. I stared at the family photos on the wall, perfect smiles, perfect poses, and noticed for the first time that I was missing from nearly all of them. Years of birthdays, holidays, vacations, and in most, there was no trace of me. I was a ghost in my own family's story. The aftermath of silence is not only loneliness, it's realization. It's the painful recognition that your role has been rewritten without your consent, that you are present only when useful, absent when inconvenient, that the people you love most have drawn a line and you are on the other side of it. That night, as I sat in that house, I realized something I had been avoiding for years. Silence is not neutral. It speaks. And in my family, it spoke clearly. You don't matter here. When Miles and Joy returned, laughing from their evening out, they barely noticed me gathering my things. Miles muttered a thank you. Joy said nothing, and as I walked out the door, the silence followed me once more, wrapping around my shoulders like a shroud. Back home, I stood in my kitchen again, staring at the quiet. But this time, something was different. The silence didn't just echo with humiliation. It whispered of a choice I would eventually have to make, to continue living in their silence or to finally break mine. The night I finally picked up a pen, the silence had become unbearable. It pressed against my chest like a weight, making it hard to breathe. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had once helped Miles with his homework, where Emma and Tommy had colored with crayons, where birthday cakes had been sliced and stories had been told. Now it was just me, the hum of the refrigerator in the background, and a notepad waiting to be filled. At first, I didn't know what to write. My hand hovered above the page, trembling. But then a thought came. What have I actually given? So I began to list it out. Babysitting, countless weekends, evenings, vacations. Money, preschool tuition, swim lessons, gymnastics, down payment for house, down payment for SUV, emergencies. Food. Groceries delivered, meals cooked, cakes baked, leftovers packed. Time. Missed vacations of my own, canceled outings with friends, nights spent alone while watching their children. Energy. Cleaning up, caring for the children, being available on call at any hour. The list grew longer and longer until my hand ached from writing. Every line was a reminder of the pieces of myself I had given away freely, believing I was building love with every sacrifice. By the time I stopped, 3 pages were filled. I stared at them in disbelief. 3 pages of giving. Then, almost without thinking, I turned to a new page and wrote at the top, "What I have received in return." The pen didn't move for a long time. Finally, I wrote, "Thank you, sometimes." Then, occasional hugs from grandchildren. And after that, nothing. The emptiness of that page cut deeper than any whisper could. On one side, 3 full pages of sacrifice. On the other, barely a handful of acknowledgments. It was like staring at a scale so unbalanced, it threatened to tip over completely. I pressed the pen harder against the paper, writing the truth I had avoided for years. This isn't love. This is transaction. The word shocked me. Transaction. As if every hug, every smile, every request had been weighed and measured, calculated against what I could provide. It was the kind of realization that makes you sit back in your chair, your breath catching, your world tilting slightly. I had given because I thought that was what love meant. But in their eyes, my giving had become the currency of my place in their lives. Without it, who was I? The next night, I returned to the notepad. This time, I titled the page, "What I Will Never Do Again." Line by line, I began to take myself back. I will not pay another bill that isn't mine. I will not cancel plans to be their last-minute solution. I will not silence myself when I am hurt. I will not mistake obligation for love. That list felt different. It didn't ache like the first one. It didn't sting like the second. This one felt steady, almost defiant. For the first time in years, I felt a flicker of control, as though my life was no longer just something to be used by others. But making the lists was not just about reclaiming control. It was about finally admitting the truth. I had been complicit in my own erasure. Every time I said yes without hesitation, every time I swallowed my hurt, every time I smiled through the humiliation, I had allowed them to believe this was normal, that I existed to serve, not to be loved. It was a hard truth, but it was mine, and writing it down made it real. The lists became a ritual. Every evening, I sat at that table, pen in hand, and poured out everything I had never said aloud. Sometimes it was memories, times when I should have spoken up but didn't. Sometimes it was promises to myself about the future. Sometimes it was just words of anger that I needed to get out of my chest. One night, I found myself writing, "They don't get to define me anymore." The words glowed. The truth is, we rarely see ourselves clearly when we are in the middle of giving everything away. Devotion can feel noble. Sacrifice can feel righteous. But sometimes, it takes the quiet voice of someone outside the storm to remind you that you are drowning. That someone, for me, was my neighbor Eleanor. Eleanor lived 3 doors down, in a little blue house with a sagging porch and a garden full of wild roses that never seemed to care about the seasons. She was a widow, older than me by a few years, with a voice that carried the weight of experience and eyes that seemed to notice what others overlooked. We weren't close friends, not at first. Just polite neighbors who waved when we passed, who exchanged cookies during the holidays. But the week after the restaurant incident, she knocked on my door. "I saw you come home that night," she said gently, her eyes scanning my face. "You looked smaller, Smaller. The word pierced me, because that was exactly how I had felt, shrunk down, diminished, as though Joy's whisper had taken not only my dignity, but my very size in the world. I invited her in, and we sat at my kitchen table. She noticed the notepad, the lists I had been writing, pages spread across the surface like scattered pieces of myself. She didn't pry. She simply sipped the tea I offered, and waited until I began to speak. At first, the words came haltingly. I told her about the cake, about the whisper, about the silence that followed. I told her about the years of giving, the weekends spent babysitting, the money that vanished into other people's lives. I told her about the sweaters left unworn, the cupcakes forgotten, the invitations that never came. When I finished, my throat was tight, my eyes burning. I braced myself for the usual responses. I'm sure they didn't mean it, or maybe you're overthinking it. That's what most people said when I tried, tentatively, to share the truth. But Eleanor didn't say that. She leaned forward, her hands folded neatly around her teacup, and asked a single question. Do you know the difference between love and obligation? I blinked. Aren't they the same sometimes? No, she said softly. They shouldn't be. Love is given freely, with joy. Obligation is demanded with expectation. You've been mistaking one for the other. Her words settled into the silence like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything I thought I knew. Love versus obligation. The distinction was so clear when she said it, and yet I realized I had blurred the line for years. I thought back to my lists. 3 pages of giving, almost nothing in return. That wasn't love. It was obligation, dressed up as devotion. Eleanor reached across the table, her fingers brushing the edge of one of my pages. You are not selfish for wanting respect. You are not cruel for wanting to be loved as a person, not as a resource. Don't let them trick you into believing otherwise. Something cracked inside me then. Not the painful crack of humiliation, but the gentler crack of awakening. Like a window opening after years of being sealed shut. We talked for hours that day. She told me her own story. How her sons had drifted away after her husband died. How she had spent years pouring herself into their lives, only to realize they saw her as a safety net, not as a mother. It nearly broke me, she admitted. But I learned that you can't force people to value you. You can only choose to stop letting them devalue you. Her voice was steady, her gaze unwavering. You matter, Marlene. Even if they don't see it, especially if they don't see it. That was the gentle reminder I hadn't known I was waiting for. After she left, I sat again at my kitchen table, staring at the lists. But this time, I didn't feel crushed by them. I felt seen. Not by Miles, not by Joy, not even by the grandchildren, but by someone who understood. Someone who had walked a similar road and survived. Eleanor's reminder didn't erase the pain. It didn't undo the humiliation or mend the cracks in my family. But it gave me something I had been missing. Permission. Permission to stop equating silence with love. Permission to stop mistaking obligation for devotion. Permission to believe that my worth wasn't tied to how much I could give. And that small permission began to grow inside me like a seed. The next time Miles called, asking if I could watch the kids, I didn't answer immediately. I hesitated. That hesitation was new. It was tiny, but it was a start. When Joy criticized the way I folded laundry, I didn't apologize. I simply placed the clothes down and walked away. It wasn't defiance, it was self-preservation. Eleanor noticed the changes. On her evening walks, she would wave at me across the fence and smile knowingly, as if to say, "You're finding yourself again." And she was right. Boundaries are strange things. We all know they exist, yet the people closest to us often pretend not to see them. And sometimes, we ourselves forget to draw them. Until one day, we realize we've been living without walls, letting everyone walk in and out, taking whatever they want, whenever they want. That realization came to me slowly, like dawn creeping over a dark horizon. It began with Eleanor's words still echoing in my mind. You've been mistaking obligation for love. The truth settled heavy inside me. If I didn't draw lines, no one else would. So I began, carefully, quietly, in ways that felt almost foreign. The first time was when Miles called on a Wednesday evening. His voice was brisk, distracted, as usual. Mom, can you come watch the kids Friday night? Joy and I have a dinner thing. Normally, the answer would have flown out of my mouth. Yes, of course, what time? But this time, I paused. The silence on my end stretched long enough that he finally said, Mom? Are you there? Yes, I replied, my voice steady, though my hands were trembling. But I already have plans on Friday. It wasn't true. My only plan had been to spend the evening alone with a book. But that, I realized, counted as a plan. My time, my rest, my peace, they mattered. Oh, Miles said, clearly taken aback. Well, I guess we'll figure something else out. I hung up the phone, my heart pounding. I had said no. For the first time in years, I had refused, and the world didn't collapse. The children weren't harmed. The family didn't disown me. All that happened was that Miles had to make other arrangements. That was my first boundary. Small, but monumental. The second came when Joy criticized me again, this time for the way I handled Tommy's tantrum. She spoke sharply, in that voice meant to cut, with Miles sitting silently beside her. You're spoiling him, she said. You don't know how to set limits. The old me would have apologized, tried to adjust, tried to prove myself worthy of her approval. But this time, I simply looked her in the eye and said, I raised a son who turned out just fine. I don't need your approval. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Miles shifted uncomfortably. The room felt charged, heavy. But for once, I didn't fill the silence. I let it stand. I let her sit with it. That was my second boundary. With every new line I drew, something inside me grew stronger. I realized that boundaries weren't walls keeping people out. They were doors, teaching people how to come in respectfully. They were not punishments. They were lessons. Lessons I had avoided teaching for too long. But boundaries are rarely welcomed by those who benefit from your lack of them. Miles began to call less, except when he absolutely needed something. Joy's tone grew colder, sharper, her criticisms more frequent. She accused me of being selfish, of changing, of trying to distance myself from the family. And maybe she was right. I was changing. I was distancing myself. Not from family, but from the version of myself who had accepted humiliation as the cost of belonging. The hardest part, though, wasn't standing up to them. It was standing up to myself. Because every time I said no, guilt clawed at me. What if the children needed me? What if Joy convinced Miles that I was cruel? What if my refusal meant losing them forever? These thoughts swirled in my mind, louder than any words Joy had spoken. But then, I would return to my lists, to the pages where I had written what I had given, what I had received, what I would never do again. And I reminded myself, boundaries were not cruelty. They were survival. One evening, Eleanor and I sat on her porch, the scent of her roses filling the warm air. I confessed my fears to her, the guilt, the dread of losing my grandchildren, the weight of saying no. She listened quietly, then said, Marlene, love without boundaries isn't love, it's exploitation. You're teaching them how to treat you, and it's never too late to start teaching differently. Her words steadied me, so I kept drawing the lines. Sometimes small, declining a last-minute request, leaving early when the criticisms grew too sharp. Sometimes larger, refusing to lend more money, reminding Miles that he had the means to handle his own bills. Each act felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that I had long abandoned. The backlash came, of course. Angry phone calls, long silences, cold shoulders. Joy accused me of being dramatic. Miles said I was overreacting. But I noticed something else too. The more I held my boundaries, the lighter I felt. I began to see that every no I gave them was a yes I gave myself. Yes to peace. Yes to dignity. Yes to the possibility of a life outside their demands.